An American athlete is physically abused in a Japanese prisoner of war camp for 2 years after surviving a 45-day shipwreck in shark-infested waters. One day, his Japanese enforcer sees him weak and without strength. That's why he was challenged to lift an extremely heavy beam in order to end his life, because if he doesn't do it, he will get shot. Before being a prisoner, Louis Zamperini had won the Olympics without expecting that his life would change completely with the arrival of the Second World War in 1936, when he, together with other soldiers, carried out a bombing mission over Japan. During the attack, they are surprised by the Japanese. So the crew tries to close the hatches to protect their lives, but they find themselves stuck. Then the crew members live moments of great tension in the face of imminent danger where some of them are injured. Given the damage suffered by the aircraft, the pilot decides to make a forced landing where they apparently manage to escape unharmed. Now we go back years. We see that Louis is a child who always gets into trouble, and this time he runs while being chased by a policeman who catches him thanks to some boys who approach him to intimidate him, and takes him to his father, a very strict Italian, who hits him as a corrective. Days later, his brother Pete, seeing Louis once again running fast when he was caught smoking and drinking alcohol, comes up with the fantastic idea of training him to participate in races, and thus stop being lazy, so that when he grows up be a productive man. So at the beginning of the training, Louis looks a bit bummed out, but with daily practice, and a little bit of time he becomes a great athlete called El Tornado, due to his great speed. Pete with his dedication makes Louis improve more and more, since he plans to participate in the 1936 Olympic Games that will take place in Berlin, for which he becomes the pride of the family. But then World War II breaks out and Louis must go to Japan immediately to defend the homeland from him, already as a soldier. At this point in the story we return to the moment of the forced landing, where Louis receives another order to go and rescue some soldiers who fell in the middle of the ocean. So Louis and his team fly to the rescue, but halfway through the flight the plane begins to have a failure in its engines, and the crew begins to despair, since the plane is about to fall into the sea. And it is just at that moment when everyone in the aircraft is terrified, that Louis begins to remember when the opening of the Olympic Games took place, and his participation in them. As his family listens to the race on the radio, Louis stars in an extraordinary role, when on the last lap all the competitors slowly left him behind, but amazingly he manages to move up positions, until reaching first place and breaking the national record. Returning to reality, it can be seen when the aircraft plunges into the sea and sinks, they live moments of despair to try to get out and survive. Especially Louis, whose leg gets stuck in a part of the plane, but after so much anguish, manages to let go and rise to the surface along with 2 more survivors of the crew. When they are already safe in the boats, they treat the wound on the head of one of the survivors. Now with an uncertain future, they must perform a great feat to survive with just a chocolate and just a bottle of water, until someone finds them and rescues them. If they succeed, they will be true warriors. At dawn a plane flies over near them and the noise wakes them up, so Louis shoots a flare while the others begin to signal for help, but the plane ignores them and they continue on their way. Every day that passes is a challenge to stay alive under the inclement sun, and the hunger that becomes unbearable. But joy returns to their faces when a bird lands on the boat. They think that by eating their raw meat, they will appease their hunger, but the disgust felt by those men when eating was so great that seconds later they all end up throwing it away. So they take what's left of the bird and use it as bait to attract the fish, and that's how they enjoy tasty and nutritious raw fish. After a few days lost at sea, and with severe burns on their faces, caused by the ravages of the sun, and the lack of water, they begin to keep active by talking so as not to go crazy. One night Louis gazes at the stars as a controversy rages over God's plans for each of the survivors. But that morning there is a strong storm that agitates the waters so strongly that fear seizes them, so they have to hold on to the rope of the boat to avoid falling into the sea, and it is then that Louis promises God that if saves him, he will dedicate himself to serving God for the rest of his life.
Whatever you want.
So he survives as well as his companions. In the morning, taking advantage of the fact that it is raining, they drink water after many days of being dehydrated, so the boys are happy to know that they have been able to survive 23 days in the middle of the sea. Days later, another plane flies over again, but this time when signaling to it, it returns. They are happy because they believe that the nightmare has finally ended, but it turns out to be a Japanese plane and it begins to attack, for which they jump into the water to protect themselves. But not for long, since the sea is full of hungry sharks that go after them, and as if that were not enough, the enemy plane turns back and begins to attack again. Only Louis jumps back into the water, but worried about his friends he quickly gets out of the water and back to the boat where his friends are out of harm's way. But now they have another problem to solve, and that is that the boat is deflating because of the holes that caused the attack, and when Louis is repairing it, he suffers a new shark attack and manages to neutralize it. With every minute that passes, the chances of finding them decrease. Now it is the wounded one who begins to weaken, and after a while he loses his life, so they say their last goodbye before releasing him into the sea. Days later the two survivors are in very poor condition. Weak and dehydrated due to lack of food and water, they have been lost at sea for 45 days. 2 days later, for their luck, they wake up in front of a ship. The bad news is that it is a Japanese ship, for which, upon boarding, they are immediately arrested and taken to a dungeon. The next day they are taken to a prisoner of war camp where they are interrogated and exposed to mistreatment, beating them severely. Louis dares to ask about the other soldiers, and they tell him that they have been annihilated, removing their heads. Since then they have been constantly beaten and mistreated. They are then forced to take off their clothes to pour buckets of cold water over them, while they are humiliated. Then all the prisoners are transferred to a concentration camp in Tokyo, where they are going to be left in the baraka in quarantine. There they separate Louis and Phil into different groups. Louis looks nostalgically at the city, and if the Olympics had not been cancelled due to the war, he would have liked to participate in them. Then Corporal Watanabe appears and tells them that they will be treated as enemies of Japan. He immediately goes up to Louis to tell him to look at him, and when he does, he punches him in the face. Louis looks at him 2 more times, causing another punch that breaks his nose.
Look at me.
Then Watanabe, before leaving, tells him to stop looking at him. That night the 2 groups of soldiers unite. And the next morning they take him out to do the exercises, in which Watanabe says that there is a lot of talent among the prisoners, so he wants to know who the Olympian is, so Louis has no choice but to raise his hand. That is why they force him to compete with a Japanese, but despite his talent, he fades because of how weak and malnourished he is. However, he gets up to continue the race, and when he falls again, Watanabe begins to hit him, letting him know that Louis doesn't mean anything anymore.
You're nothing.
In the following days the prisoners are subjected to heavy labor, and are forced to dispose of their feces. There everyone collaborates to have more confidential information hidden from the enemies, but later a Japanese discovers part of a map that was stolen from the Japanese under a bed, so the other prisoners are beaten in front of everyone to set an example. After 2 years, living as a slave and without any hope, one night one of the Japanese looks for Louis and is forcibly taken to Watanabe, who tells him that he has become famous through the networks, but that everyone in the United States, including his parents, leave him for dead. That is why they propose that he go to a radio station in Tokyo, to a program called The Messenger Calls, to inform his parents that he is alive and they are treating him well, wishing them Merry Christmas. Both his brother and his parents are very happy to hear his voice.
Through the war until the end. That's our revenge.
Sad and devastated, they take him to eat in a restaurant as a reward for having obeyed. There, Japanese officials approach him to propose that he speak ill of the United States on the radio. They tell him that he must accept the privileges they give him, or else he will return to the concentration camp. But since Louis refuses to do so, they lock him up again. Upon returning, Watanabe compares him to him for being a strong man, but despite that he is still an enemy of Japan. So he gives her a welcome punch, and orders the other prisoners one by one to punch his partner in the face. He leaves Louis lying on the ground almost lifeless. The next morning the prisoners organize a play, being the first time since they arrived that they enjoy and laugh. At that moment, Watanabe approaches Louis and tells him that he has been promoted, and they are going to transfer him to another place, for which the prisoners are happy because they imagine that they will be better off without him. But soon there is an attack with the Allies and they are evacuated to another camp, and everyone is surprised when the person in charge is Watanabe himself. Immediately they begin to carry out heavy work in the coal mines and to be treated as slaves, since if they do not obey they will leave there lifeless. Then to make them think they lost the war, they give him the news that the President of the United States has lost his life. Later, Sergeant Watanabe, seeing Louis who can barely stand, ends up throwing him to the ground with a shovel, to later challenge him to carry a heavy beam on his head, and threatens to take his life if he drops it. Then he, almost without strength, makes his best effort, and looking into his eyes, he gets the necessary energy to finish lifting her, but this leaves Watanabe very surprised, for which he soon hits him again until he is unconscious. The next day the Japanese tell the prisoners that the war is coming to an end, so they invite them to bathe in a river. There they know they will be annihilated, that is why full of fear and without hope they slowly enter the water. But about to be the end for them, an American plane passes by, which means that the Japanese have surrendered and come to rescue them because the war is over. The first thing the prisoners receive is food and magazines. Then Louis enters Watanabe's room and realizes that his father is a cruel dictator of that country, which makes Louis understand everything that happened. Hours later, upon arriving in his country, Louis kisses the ground, and after being a prisoner for many years, he is received by his family and the press. The end of the war left a very scarred Louis. Now he will have the new challenge of defeating the ghosts of the past, which night after night come to life in his dreams. He is as happy as his family to be together again. So they pay tribute to him, and play the audio that gave them hope of seeing him again, when everyone believed that he had lost his life in that war.
Apágalo.
Louis gets upset because for him, that audio is something that he prefers to forget, since it does not bring back good memories, because they forced him to lie about the treatment that the Japanese gave him. But everything is not bad for Louis, because he immediately has a proposal from an army officer, who needs him to work as a promoter of war bonds, since the end of the battle in Japan the bonds have fallen disproportionately. He accepts and begins to promote them, but Louis is not emotionally well, which makes liquor his favorite company night after night, while during the day he does promotional conferences for him. This causes him to lose control one day, and he begins to speak nonsense, discouraging the public when he realizes that he is drunk. This bothers the officer a lot, and he sends him to Florida for 3 days to relax and stop drinking. The next day, already on the beaches of Miami Beach, he looks at a pretty girl, and hours later he strikes up a conversation with her. Her name is Cynthia, and since she saw her she knows that she is the love of her life, since from the first moment they saw each other they fell in love. At dawn he takes her fishing and then to the movies, and just before the movie starts, the main news starts showing the Japanese being tried for war crimes, and at that moment they talk about Watanabe, so Louis for a few seconds. Thousands of memories of torture and cruelty that Japanese applied to him go through his mind, and he immediately leaves the room, very upset and confused. Cynthia gives him all her understanding because she loves him, and he immediately asks her to marry him, staring into her eyes, since he has to return soon and doesn't want to leave alone, for which she immediately accepts. His wife, in one of the conversations with him, suggests that she train again, but he knows that he is no longer a boy, and he does not have the same skills as years ago. So for now they get married and move in together. She is a woman with a lot of faith in God, and she prays a lot for Louis as she sees how every night he relives his cruel past. Louis, seeing that his nightmares and hallucinations of him worsen, decides to go to the hospital for war veterans to consult a psychologist, although he does not believe much in them. The next day Louis begins to look for a job, since until now he has lived on the compensation that the government gave his mother when they left him for dead. On the other hand, Cynthia, to encourage him, buys him some shoes so that he can start training, so that he can attend the next London Olympics. In addition to training, she prays for him every night. The least expected day Cynthia becomes pregnant and tells her mother-in-law, but for now she hides it from her husband so as not to worry him, since they have many expenses. Practices continue every morning, and the performance seems to increase with the days. But suddenly something happens that they did not expect. Louis falls while he is training, injuring his foot as a result. Already at the clinic, he tells Cynthia that since he was little he always blamed God for everything that happens to him. At that moment she gives him the sad news that now he won't be able to run anymore. Very overwhelmed, he arrives home, and when night falls, nightmares and hallucinations invade his mind. Failing to overcome the trauma of having eaten rotten food with worms, for which he sees worms in every meal he is given and puts together a whole show. Cynthia, seeing that her husband's behavior does not improve, she dares to open the trunk where the objects that she brought when the war ended, and the photos that she discovers are terrifying. She finds out about all the mistreatment she received from Watanabe and the abominable crimes that are committed in the war. But Louis starts drinking alcohol again and uses it as an excuse for his constant nightmares, until one day his wife tells him that she is pregnant. Now, to improve his relationship with his family, he decides to go back to the psychiatrist, who recommends applying various treatments. But he feels that he is not going to be able to, so he continues to drink alcohol while hiding from her. Finally, Louis talks to his brother Pete about him and acknowledges that he can't take it anymore. Then the girl is born and they name her Cynthia after her mother. Louis feels happy and proves to be a very good father, since he is always there when the girl needs him. But even Louis still can't get a job and takes refuge again in alcohol. He sinks deeper and deeper into his war traumas, drowning in them, while Cynthia gets the peace he needs in the church. As Cynthia thinks that the only way to help him is to bring him closer to Christ, she tells him that she loves him and that she does not think of divorcing her, and in turn she invites him to participate in the church. Although several times Louis flees from the church because of hallucinations of him, this time he falls into a deep depression. Then Cynthia makes him understand how disappointing it will be for Cece when she grows up having an alcoholic father, so out of love for his family he continues to attend church, until one day the pastor's words made him reflect.
Stop the wars.
You need help.
It is at that moment that the miracle that they expected so much occurs, since she understands everything and her life changes when she receives Jesus Christ and overthrows her ghosts. It is now that the war really ended for him. And she begins to understand the strength of faith in God by remembering the promise that one day, about to die in the middle of the ocean, she made to God to always serve him, and clearly understands why God kept him alive. After this, Louis travels to Japan to look for Watanabe, but they still can't find him, and as a token of forgiveness he leaves the officer a Bible with the message that he says to read Matthew chapter 6 verse 14, which says, "Because yes, forgive others, when they sin against you the Heavenly Father will too." Louis forgives his captors, and then hugs, blesses, and gives words of encouragement to each of the Japanese. After Louis forgave Watanabe, he had no more nightmares or hallucinations and found deep peace. He also stopped drinking and started a new life as a Christian speaker, telling his story across the country. In 1952, he founded a camp called Victory Boys in Los Angeles to assist in the rehabilitation of juvenile delinquents, leading them to a full knowledge of Jesus Christ. Watanabe was one of the cruelest criminals of the Second World War, and remained hidden for several years, until he was granted amnesty for the sake of reconciliation with Japan. Phil Russell, since he survived the war, married his girlfriend, and is still Louis's best friend. Louis in 1988, at the age of 80, fulfilled his dream of running again in the Olympics that were held in Japan that year. Louis Zamperini passed away in 2014. This is the summary of a Christian movie based on true events called Unbreakable Part 1 and Part 2. Click here and do not miss the next story.